These are the opening bars to Cole Porter's 1930s track, Anything Goes. A song which conjures up the hope and permissiveness of the period that I'm basing this week's narrative around. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name's Scott East and I've been teaching as a tutor in this course this session. In Narratives of Modernity, we've told a range of stories about culture and life in the modern era. Along the way, we've been arguing that the stories we tell about our cultural histories matter, because they continue to shape our imaginaries and hence our futures. Simplifying to the extreme, we can imagine how modernism could become a story of the disconnected artistic genius, usually dead white men from faraway lands, well, at least when heard from here in Australia, and their heroic tales of aesthetic innovation. However, the stories we've tried to tell in this course have less been about separate analyses of style and attempted to explore the connections with historical, social, political and technological issues. A conventional art historical narrative might assume that Australian modernism inevitably lagged behind developments originating elsewhere in Europe or later North America. However, broadening out what we think about modernism, I think is useful. The Australian example is useful because it demonstrates the complex and multidimensional nature of concepts such as modernism and modernity. Was modernism a single story towards abstraction, or an acceptance or rejection of modern life? Or was there more than one way to be modern? I add this tale of Australian modernism not in the hope that if enough stories are told, we might have a comprehensive picture of modernism. The stories that are told are always partial and have exclusions. As historian Jill Matthews recently put it, modern is a bugger of a concept to work with, and whoever does so will get into strife. But I hope this story will help you see the diversity of what it meant to make art and design, and respond to the modern changing world. The dominant stories of modernism as something that happened elsewhere and only gets received down under has much more subtler and sophisticated accounts. Consider this quote from the Queensland Art Gallery's exhibition text, explaining their recent rehang of their Australian galleries. Like expatriates in previous decades, artists in Sydney and Melbourne often looked to Europe for inspiration, the inspiration obviously occurring elsewhere in this text. Their eclectic and often cautious art became increasingly influenced by European modernist culture, at first through reproductions in books and magazines, which is what I want to primarily focus on today, and later through frequent travel abroad. Like I just indicated, such perspectives are useful, at least for a moment, to foreground the role of the media in disseminating ideas and tastes. One of the stories I want to track today is how the taste for a modern home was produced and circulated in the print media of Australia in the 20s and 30s. The Home magazine, with its stylish layout and plentiful advice regarding design and fashion, especially what the modern home should be, was a key vehicle for those choosing to publicise modernism in Australia. The account from the Queensland Art Gallery is useful as it continues and instructs us that several competing forms of modernism developed in Australia. Modernism was only one narrative in Australian art during this period. Accordingly, modernism was not officially sanctioned, nor was it widely popular. Modernist artists struggled for recognition, where more traditional conceptions of artistic practice continued to flourish, especially landscape painting and portraiture. The young Sydney moderns we are looking at today looked outwards towards America, Asia and continental Europe, more so than to England. They weren't particularly avant-garde nor revolutionary. Rather, they were tasteful and refined and promoted intelligence and talent. Most importantly, for my argument today, they did not disdain the popular or the commercial. Although, like many of the other moderns we've looked at in this course, they rejected convention. And in Australia, This meant the heroic imagery of the Australian bush, of the Heidelberg School, which had such a defining role in the formation of the Australian identity, occurring around the Federation of Australia. You might notice the influence of another modern style we've looked at in the course this session, namely Impressionism. As you might expect from what I've already said, this is a partial history of Australian modernism. And there were many other very interesting stories that, depending on your own interests, you might want to follow up. For example, painting students, you might like to investigate artists like Clarence Beckett and the other tonalists who assembled around the character Max Meldrum in Melbourne. Thinking about the home, in the preface to Marshall Berman's All That's Solid That Melts Into Air, of which the introduction was assigned as a starting point for our investigations in the course this year, Berman defines modernism as, quote, any attempt by modern men and women to become subjects as well as objects of modernization, to get a grip on the modern world and make themselves at home in it. This active response of homemaking is a much broader definition than you'll find encompassed in most art, design, or history books. It was one of the stimuluses for the story that I wanted to focus on this week. So in this Australian story spanning the first few decades of the 20th century, I am choosing to focus on the collaborations between entrepreneurs, publishers, designers, and artists in Sydney in the 20s and 30s. The story involves 6 principal characters: 4 artists, Roy de Maistre, Margaret Preston, Thea Proctor, and Hero Roberts. The entrepreneur, publisher, patron, and administrator, Sydney Smith, and the photographer, Harold Casno. The tale is structured around a pivotal exhibition on the eve of 1930s modern Sydney. The 1929 Burdekin House exhibition of 6 modern interior rooms, organised by the inner circle of Sydney's tastemakers, who were all associated with the Smith publication, The Home. Thinking about these characters immediately brings into question the idea of an Australian story. A few of the characters were already born overseas, and a number of them had already spent time in Europe, such as Margaret Preston, who'd had 2 journeys to Europe before the time that we're looking at. Roy de Maistre, immediately after this exhibition, becomes so disillusioned with the ignorance of his work in Australia, he sets sail for London. So, in this period of Australian history, the idea that Australia is this bounded, cut-off entity is problematic. Thinking about the site for the story, the background site for the story, Burdekin House, it was a colonial mansion in Macquarie Street. The rooms downstairs were fitted out in Georgian good taste, with traditional paintings and Sheraton-style furniture. I just want to focus on the history of this scene, just for a moment. Burdekin House was built in 1841, probably by the architect James Hume, for the Sydney shopkeeper Thomas Burdekin. It was owned and occupied by members of his family until it was sold in 1922. A hotel was proposed for the site, and the Royal Australian Historical Society, historians already were leaders amongst preservationists of colonial buildings, led a deputation which included architects to campaign the state government to preserve it, claiming it was one of the finest examples of colonial domestic architecture in Sydney. This is 7 years before the exhibition that I'm focusing on today. The setting for our scene was almost lost to history. We often think that it's only a contemporary practice to try and protect our heritage. It might be eye-opening to think 90 years ago people were campaigning to save colonial history in Australia. In 1924, the house was sold to T.E. Rolfe, a Sydney businessman and philanthropist. The grand spaces on the ground floor and the back courtyard were given over to the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital Ladies Auxiliary for fundraising functions. and the upstairs rooms were let as studios for artists. Here's an example of a Roy de Maistre work in those upstairs studios that was completed sometime in the 20s. In 1933, it was sold to the trustees of St. Stephen's Presbyterian Church, only 4 years after the exhibition that we're thinking about today, and demolished, leaving unresolved tensions between the historical, memorial, and aesthetic meanings of the place. The loss really galvanised those campaigning for preservation of colonial buildings in Sydney, and really led to a change of approach from a primarily historical approach to preservation to installing more systematic approaches to preservation in Sydney. In 1929, Sydney-siders could step into a modernist display home. The idea was driven by Roy de Maistre, who had seen the lavish pavilion interiors at the 1925 Decorative Arts exhibition in Paris. He collaborated on an Australian version with artists, architects, designers, a Japanese scholar, and Leon Gellert, co-editor of Art in Australia and the Home magazine at the time. The rooms upstairs contrasted dramatically with the grand rooms downstairs. They conveyed a range of tastes associated with modernism. The new Art Deco taste from New York, the associated with modernism, the Japanese inspired interior by Professor Sadler, the restrained Cubist and Art Deco detailing of fireplaces and cabinets, and the Mondrian-style rugs. All in bold tones were the work of artists Roy de Maistre, Adrian Faint, Thea Proctor, and writer Leon Gellert. Implement Blue, a work by Margaret Preston, is all that now remains of the Burdekin House exhibition, a work that we'll look at in a moment. Smith campaigned for the house to be sponsored and the exhibition preserved, as an example of the latest in modern taste. But the Wall Street stock market crash hit around this time, and no benefactor could step forward. It has been suggested that this failure of the Burdekin House exhibition to be well received was one of the driving forces to make Roy de Maistre finally give up Australia and head for London. The Art Gallery of New South Wales has an exhibition opening in July called Sydney Moderns, and the exhibition, I'm told, will contain a reconstruction of the Burdekin House rooms. At the moment, it's still in the workshops. I hear from those working on it, but it'll be a really exciting to be able to actually see this exhibition recreated in this probably biggest example of Sydney modernism that will come to the Art Gallery of New South Wales in July. I just want to provide a quote that will give you a bit of a sense of what the official art establishment thought of modernism in the time, and perhaps it gives another reason for wanting to focus primarily on the domestic and the home in this lecture. Notable amongst the critics of modernism in Australia was Lionel Lindsay, artist, writer and critic, James MacDonald, the director of the National Gallery of Victoria at the time, and Robert Menzies, the famous Australian politician. Here's a quote, some more examples of the Burdekin House and what it looked like. In terms of here you can see the downstairs as well as upstairs rooms. And here's a quote from Jimmy MacDonald in 1934, writing in the bulletin that I wanted to share with you. "This development, modern art, has led to the emergence in numbers of what the Americans call pansies, and fine allies they make. These beings can trim a hat or tie a bow with any girl. Both can talk art, though neither think nor express themselves in anything but insignificant form. They rule the world of art today, and unless real painters speak up for themselves and write art, The women and their near abettors will ruin both. Significant form is under attack by women and pansies, who have emerged because of the developments in modern art. For this director of the National Gallery of Victoria, prior to this appointment, MacDonald had served as the director of Art Gallery of New South Wales, but moved to Victoria to take up the national appointment. Only real painters can save art. This statement provides a very clear hierarchy for the arts, with painting clearly the saviour for real art. And so this inability to consider the very important developments that were happening in regards to interior design and the domestic sphere is part of the reason that I want to look at the Home magazine as an example of the reception of modernism in Australia. This period in Australian public life was obviously dominated by very conservative male art hierarchy, and often aligned their hatred of modernism with women. This is an important point about modernism in Australia during this time. There was lots of resistance to it in the official art worlds, and this is perhaps one reason why the home and design becomes a much clearer expression of modernism in the Australian context. Another exchange will give you a sense of the terms of opposition to modernism in Australia during this period. In 1925, the student magazine Undergrowth, a very important vehicle for art students at the time, publishing their ideas, talks about a recent event held by the Royal Art Society, and the article's entitled Cezanne, the Influx and Influence in Australia. It recounts that at its regular meetings, this particular night, looking at the reception of European modernism, was so well attended that various studio furnishings had to be appropriated for seating. The event was arranged by Mr. Howard Ashton, also known as Julian Ashton, the famous art educator, who recently saw fit to publish in the press that Cezanne had missed his vocation in life and should have been a pork butcher. And so this statement in the press led to the Royal Art Society to have an evening discussion about this. In defence of modern art stood Roland Wakelin. Wakelin had been educated in Wellington and was first exposed to modern painting by a fellow student of his, Nora Simpson, 12 years earlier. Simpson had returned from abroad with reproductions of works by Cezanne, Gauguin, Matisse and Picasso. Wakelin was another artist who began working for Sydney Smith back in 1916 as a commercial artist. Of course, such views should be no surprise, as Ashton was an aggressive opponent of modernism in Australia, having dismissed a 1919 exhibition of Wakelin and de Maistre, of which we can see examples of the works on screen now, their experiments in post-impressionism as, quote, elaborate and pretentious bosh. Also, thinking about the students in the cohort of students in the course this year, we have students interested in art, design and media. I think this narrative is interesting because of the multiple roles that creative practitioners played. They seamlessly span the worlds of art, exhibitions, design and decor, with little regard for what real art should be. Thinking about this time in Sydney, after World War I was announced to be over, Australia as a nation was eager to leave the hardships of war behind them. Introductions to the domestic household was meant to improve the quality of life. The automobile and the wireless were changing the way people lived and began shaping the industry around it. Obviously, as already alluded to, this was an era of a traditional family structure, where it was understood that the man would be viewed as the sole breadwinner. This story, though, is one of advertising, photography, film, fashion, milk bars, public space, and art. The time between the wars in Australia was one of hotel cultures and movie-going that was booming in Australia at the time. In July 1929, Hoyts makes headlines for converting 20 suburban theatres ready for talkies in Melbourne. The first half of the 20th century in Australia had undergone rapid modernisation. And this is most clearly articulated in the fascination of the artists that I've talked about so far with the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The first stone in the construction of the bridge was laid in 1925, and it was not finally joined and opened until 1932. So in the year of the Burdekin House exhibition, we might expect that this impressive symbol of modern construction and engineering was looming over the city skyline. The city, as we know it now, was starting to take shape. As I've already alluded to, many stories of Australian culture in this period make it impossible to pin down whether there is something that is essentially Australian about the art or design that was produced here. Did it just repeat in a less original way developments that were occurring elsewhere? The two quotes on screen at the moment provide a bit of a sense of the terms of this debate. Danga, in the student magazine Undergrowth, is arguing that there is no such thing as Australian art. Where Preston below is being very clear about what she doesn't like about Australiana, those wretched kookaburras, gum leaves and wattle blossoms done on cushions, but is arguing that they needed to make the Australian homes more Australian in atmosphere. This is a good moment to turn to the Home magazine. It was published from 1920 through to 1942, when it ended due to paper rationing because of the war, most probably. And an advertisement for the Home that you can read in italics below there on the screen. I'll just read it to you. The Home reflects the modern spirit in Australia. It is the one authority in Australia in matters of good taste, and has come to be recognised as one of the finest journals in the world today. It is in a state of continual warfare with the commonplace and drab. Subscribe now and keep your mind in the mood of the moment, and make your home a fit setting for the interesting and brilliant life of this century. A subscriber to the Home can never be old-fashioned or ordinary. Each issue celebrated an event or a pastime, from holiday seasons to food, home decorating to travel. Leading Australian artists that I've already mentioned, including Thea Proctor, Margaret Preston and Hera Roberts, designed the vivid artwork for the covers. In its early years, the Home was a conscious advocate of spare off-white interiors, accented by Georgian-style furniture, silver, Turkish rugs, and the traditional paintings, which demonstrated connoisseurship and the rule of taste. It also was a key source for the knowledge about antique and reproduction furniture that was available in Sydney. Sydney Smith launched the Home magazine in February 1920 as a monthly publication for upper-middle-class Australian housewives. Its articles and artwork reflected the dawn of modernism in Australia, with a focus on holiday destinations, as I mentioned, home decorating, fashion, cosmetics, cultural events, and other amusements. Its excellences in content and printing propelled it into the league of international magazines of the time, such as Harper's Bazaar, Vogue, and Vanity Fair. And it was certainly distinguished from all other Australian publications. Sydney Smith's story is very much connected with a key site of culture at the time, the Hotel Australia, located in Rose Street, a narrow lane between Castlereagh and Pitt Streets. In the city where the MLC building is today. It formed the centre for Sydney's bohemian and artistic life before the buildings were demolished. This is where Smith began his publishing career at the age of 13, when his father took over the management of the establishment. Picturing the Hotel Australia, imagine a hotel so grand that famed French actress Sarah Bernhardt performed at its opening night in 1891. An establishment so glamorous that it was the hotel of choice for Hollywood heavyweights Katharine Hepburn and Shirley Bassey and Robert Helpman. This is a very significant site in terms of Australia's media history. It was the first establishment to be granted licence to broadcast radio, and it was the location of the first television broadcast. One of the most interesting stories that will allow you to... I've actually linked to a number of sources on Omnium, including Remembering Rose Street, and the video and sound installation project last year, Good Last Drinks, One More Round at the Hotel Australia. It was part of Art and About last year, and it was a series of nighttime installations of video and sound that reinscribed the hidden history of the precinct back onto the buildings and laneways. You can view some of the stories and images collected through Omnium that I already mentioned. At 19, Smith formed a very successful commercial art studio, believed to be Australia's first advertising agency with Harry Julius. Part of what made the firm a success was their commissioning of major artists in Australia, which adopted a modern take on life. With Bertram Stevens in 1916, he founded Art in Australia, and when Stevens died, Leon Gellert replaced him as co-editor, and it was then that the second publication, The Home, was founded in 1920. Smith eventually sold the company Art in Australia Limited to the Sydney Morning Herald, and started Smith Publications in 1939. There's just an example of the Last Drinks installation project that I already mentioned. The 1939, the publications produced a number of very important texts in Australian art history. His son Sam joined the firm in 1946 and later started Art in Australia, which does continue today. Smith was on the board for of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and he influenced the major acquisition of Picasso in this time. Art in Australia was conceived by Smith as a flagship for Australian painting and graphic art. Its first issue was limited to 1,000 copies, and was produced on a quality paper with tipped-in colour reproductions of unprecedented quality for an Australian journal at the time. Robert Holden, who put together a very important exhibition of graphic arts in Australia called Cover Up in 1995, writes, "The magazine became a showcase of Australian printing ability and set new standards of advertising excellence. Artistic layout, quality graphic work in colour, and a harmonious choice of typography, plus the carefully worded text, were all combined. For over a quarter of a century and through its different formats, it reviewed and discussed all aspects of Australian art. That was exhibited in both commercials and public galleries. Special issues were dedicated to Margaret Preston, Thea Proctor, Norman and Lionel Lindsay, Hans Hyson, Will Ashton, Arthur Streeton, George Lambert, Harold Herbert, and the art of etching, bookplates, and regional special issues on Sydney, Melbourne, and Tasmania. Some have argued its longevity as a journal was due to its modern approach to design, with many covers being icons of Art Deco style in themselves, and the appearance of reproductions of Sidney Nolan, James Gleeson, and various poets in the 1940s heralded the arrival of the Angry Penguins movement, which we won't be looking at today. I now want to give you some examples of de Maistre's work. This is an example of 1927 painted furniture. It's principally known about now through its colour advertisements for it. De Maistre and fellow artist Thea Proctor had made this fashionable furniture, and it was advertised in the Home magazine in 1927. The accompanying text to this 2-page advert describes the furniture. Grace Brothers introduced painted furniture. Painted furniture, which has had a vogue in England and America for the past few years, has until now been practically unattainable in Australia. Miss Thea Proctor and Mr. Roy de Maistre have designed 2 rooms, which will be shown in our furniture department and also in our windows in Pitt Street. Roy de Maistre has always made a study of the use of colour in interior decoration. He invented the de Maistre colour harmonizing disc, an extremely clever device for obtaining colour schemes in great variety, an example of which is the images for the slide test this week. The furniture illustrated above forms part of a scheme for a room design by de Maistre, now showing in the furniture department. The painted furniture is also an extension of de Maistre's earlier experiments with colour music theories in 1919, and prior to that his use of colour in interior decoration as a therapeutic treatment for shell-shocked World War I patients. Significantly, this furniture has been argued to be a precursor to the very important Burdekin House exhibition. The well-documented exhibition is now regarded as being responsible for introducing a diluted version of the European and American geometric Art Deco style to the conservative Sydney market. These painted furniture examples, nor any of the furniture from Burdekin House survives, as far as anybody knows at the moment. This is a bedroom suite, a 6-piece child's painted wood. The maker of the furniture is unknown, and it's pretty sure that de Maistre didn't actually design this furniture, that it was pre-existing furniture that was available in department stores. But his contribution was to paint it in this style and add to the already existing manufacture. Just a couple of other examples of de Maistre's work. As I mentioned, after coming back to Australia and the reception of the Burdekin House exhibition, he leaves late that year or the next year and finds himself in London amongst people at the fringes of the avant-garde, namely Francis Bacon, who you can see there, and he later makes friends with the author Patrick Wright. De Maistre's work was not widely collected in the 20s in Australia. This work here now, the 1933 New Atlantis work, is now in the National Gallery of Australia, and it's been suggested that this is most probably Bacon's studio. The kind of stylized canvases reminiscent of some of Bacon's forms. Interestingly, the kind of non-populated main space, but this strange lurking figure in the dark outside the studio. It's quite enigmatic. Anyway, this work has now been collected by one of the major galleries. Now moving on to Margaret Preston. Here are some photos from Harold Casno of her in her garden. Primarily, she was interested in the decorative arts. In 1930, the Art Gallery of New South Wales commissioned this quite strange self-portrait of her. And she's quoted as saying there, "Yes, my self-portrait is completed, but I am a flower painter, and I am not a flower." And that might go some way to explain the kind of blank, incomprehensible look that she has on her face there. Something's caught her attention, but she seems very resigned to whatever's going on. And an example of the flower pot sits in the background there. Show you a couple examples of different designs she'd made, flower designs for the Home magazine and various other publications. The the very large copy of the Home magazine is the image for the slide test this week, and you might like to discuss the influence of Aboriginal designs. You can see the bark carving on the tree stumps there. The kind of role of Indigenous art in Preston's visual vocabulary. Here's a quote from text she'd made in 1925 called The Indigenous Art of Australia, in Art in Australia. In wishing to rid myself of mannerisms of a country other than my own, I have gone to the art of a people who had never seen or known anything different from themselves. These are the Australian Aboriginals, and it is only from the art of such people in any land that national art can spring. And this is the only work that was exhibited at the Burdekin House exhibition that, as far as people know, still survives. Implement Blue, one of Preston's most innovative works, from 1927. You can kind of, from the oblique angles, the dramatic lighting effects, and the stress on the formal and abstract qualities of her still life subject here, you can imagine the influence from commercial photography. Certainly Preston eschewed the kitsch designs of popular culture, as you saw in that quote about the kookaburras earlier. And she capitalised on the agency of women's magazines to encourage the most widest audience for her work. As has been pointed out, all organic matter in this still life has been removed, except for that slice of that wedge, that geometric wedge of lemon that's contained in one of the implements or vessels here. Barry Pearce, the head curator of Australian art at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, has said the severity of this vision may have been too much for Preston, for in other paintings of the time she softened her imagery with Australian flora. And before long, flowers, patterns returned to her work with a vengeance. In 1927, the same year that this work was completed, Preston had a text that talks about herself in the third person. She feels that this is a mechanical age, a scientific one, highly civilized and unaesthetic. She knows that the time has come to express her surroundings in her work. All around her in the simple domestic life is machinery. Patent ice chests that need no ice. Machinery does it. Irons heated by invisible heat. Washing up machines. Electric sweepers and so on. They all surround her and influence her mind. So, this work has been interpreted as embodying the values of modern living. It's very restricted palette, confined to the blue of the Home magazine, suggests the Preston's kind of desire to deal with the pictorial problems in the still life genre. The forms are reduced to their absolute essential forms. Okay, I just want to show a few covers from Hera Roberts here, and we can see her posing there on some cruise ship in Sydney Harbour on the left. We've got another very Art Deco cover for the slide test images this week, but these two particular images here are very stylish modern women who can take ski trips or look longingly out to cruise ships and aeroplanes in the sky. Is kind of emblematic of the flamboyant style of the well-known designer Hera Roberts at the time. She worked in the kind of bold modernist style of the 20s and 30s that we've been talking about, and was certainly part of the Sydney social scene. This is Harold Kasno's portrait of Doris Zinkeneisen, and was the first photographic cover for the home. Kasno's portrait manifests modernity in its clarity, its crisp use of line, and its decorative use of pattern. The leaf backdrop, painted by the Australian artist Adrian Faint, was inspired by the newly minted Poré fabrics, who John looked at last week. The kind of modish hat echoes this background, creating an effect of simultaneous flatness and depth. The gesture towards modernism's abstraction of form was a departure from Kasno's previous pictorialist style. And he was certainly conscious of the need to embrace the modern aesthetic that was kind of promoted by the home. And Leon Gellert, the editor, certainly encouraged Kasno to challenge his own style. And this portrait is probably the result. And we can see a quote there that describes what this kind of the new standard for female beauty was that the home was trying to promote. I kind of mentioned in passing earlier the kind of relationship between commercial art gallery spaces, department stores, and modern art. The David Jones Art Gallery was a key site for the display and promotion of good taste in art and design in this period. We're moving a little bit later now. In 1948, the interior designer Marion Hall Best, who interestingly earlier also had a shop front on Rose Street, so if you look at that Remembering Rose Street resource, you can find some information on her, took up the directorship of the David Jones Art Gallery space, and a key exhibition was this first exhibition of hers, 7 Designers. Hall Best had built a reputation since the 20s as an outstanding figure for the dissemination and the ideas of international modernism in relationship to interiors in Australia. In the 20s, she had studied art with Thea Proctor, and it was through her that she'd been introduced to a range of contacts in Sydney. Hall Best was originally from Dubbo, and these contacts enabled her to, throughout the 30s, work on commissions around Sydney. In 1938, she'd enrolled for a year at Sydney Uni in Architecture, but primarily was exposed to international trends in modernism and design through another form of mediation that we tend to think of as very contemporary or a recent phenomenon. But in 1939, she completed a correspondence course, a distance education course in interior decoration through a New York-based institution. Note the innovative typeset, the larger 7 and the lowercase designers, and the angle of the lowercase David Jones Art Gallery, text through the middle. Interestingly, at the same time that the exhibition is emphasizing a very modern style, note the emphasis made on the connection to the individual designer's hand through the 7 hands that form the cover. The exhibition included designed interiors with a range of homewares, including fabrics, furniture, pottery, to ice cream scoops, scarves, abstract paintings in this series of domestic interiors. The one that we're looking at here is from Gordon Andrews, and I just want to, for you to note the way high art or fine art was integrated into these interiors. Notice the kind of Miro-like painting on the left-hand side, and the very contemporary photographs that form the backdrop on the back wall there. This is kind of emblematic of Hall Best's approach, which, quote, insisted, the internal and external characteristics of a dish, a chair, a table, a machine, or a painting or sculpture are not to be separated. So rather than this kind of division between some cultural goods being the subject of mass consumption and desire, and other objects such as high art being the kind of expression of the self, all of these objects become consumable and emblematic of good taste. This connection with the David Jones gallery I just want to kind of finish on one kind of export of Australian art, and the first interaction with MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. They toured this exhibition in 1941, The Art of Australia, and it was guest curated by Professor Theodore Sizer, who kind of looks at Australia and surmises that modern art is a hornet's nest in Australia. One of the contemporary art societies in Sydney saw this exhibition as being quite hostile to modern Australian artists. The exhibition included 11 bark paintings, unidentified from the East Alligator River, and several drawings by another Indigenous artist, Tommy McRae. But it concluded with several moderns inspired by Aboriginal art. And an essay in the catalogue for this show included an essay from Margaret Preston, who explained, quote, "Its essential truths may not be visible to the human eye. The symbolism expressed through its tribal totems opens up a new world." The show toured to 29 US and Canadian museums and took this touring show. This show led to a long relationship between MoMA and the department store David Jones through its managing director Charles Lloyd. And it was actually only through the David Jones director that arranged for the director of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Will Ashton at the time, to accompany the exhibition. I just want to finish off looking at the graphic designer who produced this catalogue, Alastair Morrison, born in 1911 in Melbourne, Victoria. Morrison was a typographer, graphic designer, industrial designer, and author. Born in Melbourne, he had a celebrated design career in London, and from 1936 to 1939, returning to Australia before the war. He worked for the Reserve Bank of Australia. He also worked for P&O, Rhine-Castle Wines, and the National Trust of Australia. Morrison had said before meeting Mahauli Nagy, he had seen no real difference between what he understood to be art and what he understood to be design. Through Mahauli Nagy, he became interested in the Bauhaus attitude towards design. Morrison has said about type, "I like the discipline of it. I've always had the feeling of satisfaction of belonging to an international and almost timeless brotherhood, which Okay, and so that's where I want to stop my lecture today. I hope that you've kind of enjoyed this tale of modernism in Australia. I've included a number of links to very important exhibitions that have informed my thinking, and I definitely encourage you to check those out. Thanks very much.